The funeral was over, but she kept digging until someone gently took the shovel from her bleeding hands. The sun had long since burned itself orange against the western hills when Sarah first heard silence. Not the kind that comes with evening prayers or the soft closing of doors, but the hollow quiet that follows when voices stop pretending everything will be all right. The last of the mourners had walked away an hour past, their black boots kicking up dust that settled on Thomas's pine box like a final blessing. Mrs. Henderson from the mercantile had squeezed Sarah's shoulder with her flour-dusted fingers and whispered something about God's will. The preacher had closed his leather Bible with that soft thump that sounds like a door shutting, then climbed onto his wagon and rolled back toward town without looking behind him. Even old Pete, the gravedigger who'd been burying folks since before Sarah was born, had leaned his shovel against the cottonwood tree and mounted his gray mare. He'd tipped his hat to her before riding away, but she'd seen the worry in his eyes. The same look he'd given her when she was 7 and refused to leave her mother's bedside. Now she stood alone beside the half-filled grave, watching dirt settle on the wooden box that held what was left of her brother. The hole looked wrong somehow. Too shallow. Too small for someone who used to fill doorways with his laughter and make horses dance just by whispering their names. Sarah picked up Pete's abandoned shovel. The handle felt warm from the day's heat and rough against her palms where her gloves had worn thin. She'd been wearing these same gloves since the morning Thomas taught her to milk the cow, back when their father was still alive and their mother still sang while she cooked breakfast. The first shovelful of dirt felt heavy as grief itself. It scattered across the pine box with a sound like rain on a roof, except rain brought life, and this brought only endings. She dug the blade deep again, throwing earth behind her in steady rhythm. Each scoop felt like a prayer she couldn't say out loud, a conversation with a brother who would never answer back. The light began to fade, painting the cemetery in shades of rust and shadow. Sarah's dress, the black one she'd sewn specially for burying people, grew damp with sweat. Her hair had come loose from its careful braids and hung in dark strings around her face. Still she dug. Thomas had always said the ground in this part of Colorado was stubborn, like trying to dig through bone. He'd laughed when they'd helped their father clear stones for the winter wheat. But now Sarah understood something different about this earth. It wasn't stubborn. It was careful. It knew the weight of what it was asked to hold. She remembered the morning Thomas had ridden out to check the fence line near Miller's Creek. How he'd kissed her forehead and promised to bring back wild strawberries if he found any growing near the water. She'd watched him ride away on his chestnut mare, his hat tilted at that angle that made him look like their father. She hadn't known it would be the last time she'd see him sitting tall in his saddle, alive and whole, and believing he had years ahead of him. The horse had come back without him just as the sun was setting. Blood on the saddle, one of his boots still caught in the stirrup. Sarah dug deeper, her shoulders burning with the effort. The shovel handle began to feel slippery beneath her gloves, and when she looked down, she saw dark stains spreading across the worn leather. Her hands were bleeding where the rough wood had rubbed through the thin fabric, but the pain felt distant, like something happening to someone else. She thought about Thomas lying in that box, his face finally peaceful after 3 days of fever and delirium. How he'd gripped her hands so tight she thought he might break her fingers, and whispered things about angels and bright lights and their mother's voice calling him home. The doctor had done what he could, but a crushed chest and broken ribs were beyond his small-town healing. Some hurts ran too deep for medicine. The grave was nearly 6 feet deep now, deeper than Pete had intended to dig. Sarah's dress was soaked through with sweat, and her legs shook with exhaustion, but she kept working. Each shovelful felt like digging towards something important, something that mattered more than the ache in her back or the blood seeping through her gloves. Night sounds began to wake up around her. Crickets in the long grass. An owl calling from the old oak tree where children sometimes carve their names. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonesome song to the rising moon. But Sarah heard only the scrape of metal against earth and the whispered prayers she didn't realize she was speaking. She was thinking about the last thing Thomas had said to her, his voice barely a whisper in the lamplit bedroom they'd shared as children. Promise me something, Sarah. Promise you won't let them put me in the ground until you're sure I'm really gone." She thought he was talking nonsense, the fever making him say strange things. But now, standing in this deep hole with dirt under her fingernails and blood on her hands, she wondered if her brother had known something about dying that she was only beginning to understand. The shovel struck something hard and metallic. Sarah knelt and brushed away loose earth with her torn gloves, expecting to find a buried stone or piece of old metal. Instead, her fingers touched something smooth and round. A locket, tarnished with age and half buried in the clay soil. She held it up to catch the moonlight. It was small and delicate, the kind women wore on chains around their necks when they wanted to keep someone's picture close to their heart. Sarah tried to open it, but the catch was rusted shut with years of being underground. She slipped it into her dress pocket and reached for the shovel again. That's when she heard the footsteps, slow and careful, like someone trying not to startle a wild animal. Sarah looked up from the bottom of the grave to see a man's shadow falling across the upturned earth. He was tall and lean, wearing a dark coat and a hat that hid his face in moon shadow. A stranger, which was unusual in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business and bloodlines. "Miss," he said, and his voice was soft as worn leather. "Perhaps it's time to come up from there." Sarah tightened her grip on the shovel handle. "This is my brother's grave. I'll dig as long as I need to. I can see that." The stranger moved closer, and moonlight caught the silver buckle on his gun belt. "But your hands are bleeding, and the ground's telling you it's deep enough." She looked down at her gloves, now stained dark with blood that looked black in the pale light. The pain hit her all at once, sharp and real. Her palms felt raw, and her fingers cramped around the shovel handle. "He needs to be deeper," she said, but her voice sounded small and lost, even to herself. The stranger knelt at the edge of the grave and extended his hand toward her. "Ma'am, I've buried more folks than I care to count, and I can tell you true. 6 feet down is deep enough to keep anyone safe, even someone you love more than breathing." Sarah stared at his outstretched hand. It was scarred and weathered, the hand of someone who'd worked hard and lost much. Something about his voice made her throat tight with tears she'd been holding back since the morning Thomas had whispered her name and gone still beneath the patchwork quilt their mother had sewn. The locket in her pocket felt warm against her leg, like a secret the earth had given up just for her. She wondered who had worn it and loved it and lost it to this ground that held so many stories. She wondered if Thomas would become just another story someday. Another name carved on a wooden cross that would weather and fade until no one remembered the sound of his laughter. But standing in the bottom of this grave, looking up at a stranger's kindness in the moonlight, Sarah began to understand that some things couldn't be buried deep enough to make them safe. Sarah looked up at the stranger's outstretched hand and saw something in his face that made her chest tight. Not pity, which she'd seen too much of these past days, but understanding. The kind that comes from standing in holes just like this one, saying goodbye to people who weren't supposed to leave. "Jacob Rivers," he said, his voice quiet as church bells in the distance. "And you don't need to tell me your name unless you want to." She let him help her climb out of the grave, her legs shaking with exhaustion she hadn't felt while she was digging. The night air felt cold against her sweat-soaked dress, and she realized for the first time how long she'd been down there, how deep the darkness had grown around the edges of the cemetery. Jacob took the shovel from her bleeding hands without asking permission. His fingers were gentle when they touched hers, careful not to press against the torn places where her gloves had given way. He shrugged out of his dark coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled like wood smoke and leather and something else she couldn't name, maybe just the scent of someone who'd been traveling a long time. "Sarah," she said finally, because his kindness felt like something that deserved a name in return. "Sarah Mitchell." He nodded and settled himself on the ground beside Thomas's grave, his long legs folded beneath him like he was used to making himself comfortable in hard places. From somewhere in his coat pocket, he pulled out a small tin coffee pot and a canvas bag that looked well-traveled. "Coffee?" he asked, already beginning to gather dry sticks from beneath the cottonwood tree. Sarah wrapped his coat tighter around her shoulders and watched him build a small fire with movements that spoke of years of practice. His hands worked quick and sure, striking flint to tinder until flames caught and grew. The light danced across his face, and she could see he was younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 30, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many sunsets. "I should go home," she said, but she didn't move from where she sat. "People will be worried." Jacob poured water from a leather canteen into the coffee pot and set it near the flames. "Will they?" The question was simple, but it cut straight to the truth she'd been avoiding. Who was left to worry? Mrs. Henderson might notice her empty cabin in the morning, but worry was different from care. Worry was what neighbors felt when they thought about obligations and what people might say. Care was something deeper, something that had died with Thomas 3 days ago. "He was 17, Sarah said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "My brother Thomas." People called him Tommy because he looked so young, even after he got tall as a man. Jacob didn't say anything, just tended his fire and waited. Sarah found herself talking into the flames, watching sparks rise toward the stars like small prayers. The raiders came just after dawn. 5 of them, maybe 6. Tommy saw them from the barn and sent me to hide in the root cellar. He told me to stay there no matter what I heard, no matter how long the quiet lasted after. She pulled the coat closer around her shoulders. I should have helped him, should have stayed and fought. "How old are you?" Jacob's voice was soft, like he already knew the answer wouldn't change anything but wanted to hear anyway. 15 come October. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, the steam rising between them like incense. The smell was rich and bitter and somehow comforting. 15-year-old girls don't fight 5 grown men with guns. That's not cowardice, Miss Sarah. That's sense. Sarah accepted the cup he offered, letting the warmth seep through her torn gloves into her aching hands. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and for a moment she wondered if that's what Jacob was trying to do. Wake Thomas from his pine box with the smell of something alive and bitter and real. "He promised to teach me to ride his horse when spring came," she said. Duchess, her name was. A chestnut mare with white on her nose like someone had dipped it in fresh cream. Tommy said she was gentle enough for Sunday riding, but fast enough to outrun trouble when trouble came looking. Jacob sipped his coffee and stared into the fire. What happened to her? Shot dead in the yard, trying to protect him. Sarah's throat felt tight, remembering how she'd found them both when she finally climbed out of the root cellar. Tommy broken and bleeding in the dirt. Duchess stretched out beside him like she tried to shield his body with her own. Funny how animals know about loyalty better than most people do. "Most people never get tested," Jacob said. "Animals get tested every day just by being alive." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee that tasted like comfort and watching flames eat dry wood. Sarah studied Jacob's profile in the firelight, the way his jaw was set like he was thinking about something that hurt. His clothes were well made, but worn soft with travel, and his boots looked like they'd walked more miles than most people saw in a lifetime. "You're not from here," she said. "No, ma'am. Just passing through." "Where to?" Jacob was quiet for so long Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old sadness. "Away from where I've been." Sarah understood that kind of answer. Sometimes distance was the only medicine that worked, even when it couldn't heal what was broken. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the locket she'd found at the bottom of the grave, holding it up to catch the firelight. "Found this while I was digging. Must have been buried there for years." Jacob leaned forward to look, and something changed in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or just the universal sadness that came from finding pieces of other people's lost stories. "Pretty thing," he said. "Someone loved it once. Someone loved whoever wore it." Sarah tried again to open the tarnished catch, but it held fast. "I wonder if they're buried here too, or if they just lost it walking through on their way somewhere else. Does it matter?" The question surprised her. "I suppose not, but it feels like it should." Jacob reached into the canvas bag beside him and pulled out a piece of hardtack, breaking it in half and offering her the larger portion. It was tough as leather but tasted like salt and grain and the simple comfort of sharing food with someone who understood about being hungry. After my brother died, Jacob said, chewing slowly, I thought I needed to know everything about it. Why it happened, who was to blame, what I could have done different. Spent 2 years chasing those answers like they were going to bring him back. Did you find them? Some of them. Enough to know they didn't matter as much as I thought they would. Sarah turned the locket over in her palm, feeling its weight. Such a small thing to carry so much mystery. What mattered then? That he lived, that I loved him, that he knew it before he died. The fire had burned low, just coals now glowing like small hearts in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, the sound rolling across the sleeping town like a reminder that time kept moving whether people were ready or not. We should finish this, Jacob said, nodding toward the half-filled grave. Sarah looked down at Thomas's pine box, barely visible in the dim light. The thought of shoveling more dirt onto it made her stomach twist, but she knew Jacob was right. The dead deserved their rest, and the living deserved to let them have it. They worked together in the pre-dawn darkness, passing the shovel back and forth without speaking. Jacob's movements were steady and practiced, like he'd done this work before. Sarah's hand still hurt, but the pain felt different now. Not like punishment, but like the cost of doing something necessary and right. When the grave was level with the ground around it, Jacob smoothed the earth with the back of the shovel and stepped away. Sarah knelt and placed her hand flat against the dirt, feeling the solid weight of finished work beneath her palm. "Goodbye, Tommy," she whispered. The words felt both too small and exactly right. Jacob helped her to her feet and handed her his coat again. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the horizon the color of old roses. Soon the town would wake up and people would start their daily business of staying alive, and this long night would become just another memory to carry. "What will you do now?" Jacob asked. Sarah looked toward the distant mountains, their peaks just beginning to catch the early light. She thought about her empty cabin, her brother's horse waiting in a stable in town, and all the tomorrows stretching ahead of her like an unmarked trail. And standing there beside her brother's finished grave, with dawn breaking over the Colorado hills and a stranger's kindness wrapped around her shoulders, Sarah realized she had no idea what came next. But for the first time since Tommy died, that felt less like an ending and more like a door opening onto something she couldn't yet see. Jacob never said he was staying, but somehow his bedroll appeared under the lean-to beside the barn, and his horse found a place in the small corral next to where Thomas's gray mare used to stand. Sarah woke each morning to the sound of him chopping wood or mending harness, the steady rhythm of someone who understood that work was sometimes the only thing that kept a person moving forward. 3 days after the funeral, she found him kneeling beside Thomas's grave with a handful of wildflower seeds. Purple lupin and Indian paintbrush, the kind that grew wild in the hills and came back every spring without asking permission. Thought he might like some color come springtime, Jacob said without looking up from his planting. Sarah knelt beside him in the dirt, watching his scarred hands press seeds into the earth with the same gentle care he'd used to bandage her wounded palms. Thomas always said this land was too stubborn for flowers. Said only sage and scrub oak had the sense to grow here. Sometimes the stubborn places need flowers most, Jacob replied, brushing soil from his fingers. My Mary used to say that beauty has a way of finding the hardest ground. It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name aloud, and Sarah heard the weight it carried. She helped him pat down the loose earth, wondering what it cost him to plant hope in a place that held so much sorrow. That afternoon, they walked together to the broken fence line where Thomas had died. The wooden rails lay scattered like broken bones, some splintered by gunfire, others simply rotted with age and neglect. Sarah stood looking at the gap in their boundary, the place where safety had ended and the wild country began. He was going to fix this, she said. I've been talking about it all summer. Said a good fence was the difference between being a homesteader and being prey. Jacob ran his hand along one of the broken posts. He was right about that. A man's property line is only as strong as his ability to defend it. They worked in silence, pulling up the damaged posts and digging new holes in the hard-packed earth. Jacob had tools Sarah didn't recognize: a proper post-hole digger, a draw knife for shaping rails, a level for making sure everything stood straight and true. The work was slow and methodical, the kind that left room for thinking. "Where did you learn to do this?" Sarah asked, watching him notch a new rail to fit perfectly against the post. "My father," Jacob said. "He homesteaded in Kansas before the war. Always said there were two kinds of men in the world: those who built things and those who tore them down. He made sure I knew which kind I wanted to be." As the days passed, Sarah began to understand that Jacob's presence was changing more than just the fence line. He moved through her days like morning mist, quiet and necessary, bringing order to things that had fallen apart in ways she hadn't even noticed. He repaired the barn door that had been hanging crooked since spring. He cleaned the well and fixed the pump handle that had been sticking for months. He even coaxed their old milk cow, Bessie, back into giving a full pail each morning. But it was in the evenings, when the work was done and they sat by the fire eating beans and hardtack, that Sarah began to see past his careful reserve. She told him stories about Thomas, how her brother used to sing while milking Bessie, making up verses about her stubborn nature and switching tail. How he carved little wooden animals during the long winter nights, whittling horses and rabbits and deer so lifelike they seemed ready to run right off the mantelpiece. "He made this," Sarah said one evening, pulling a small wooden horse from her dress pocket. The carving was smooth with handling, worn from being carried close to her heart. "Gave it to me last Christmas. Said it was Moonlight, his mare, so I'd never forget her." Jacob took the carving and turned it over in his weathered hands. He had real skill. "Look at the way he got the muscle in the haunches, the arch of the neck." "Your brother saw true." "What does that mean?" "Means he looked at something living and saw not just what was there, but what made it beautiful." "That's a gift." Jacob handed the horse back to her. "Most folks look at the world and see only what they need from it: feed, shelter, something to use up. But some people see the spirit that lives inside everything. Your brother was one of those." Sarah held the wooden horse against her palm, feeling its familiar weight. "I never thought about it that way. My youngest boy, Samuel, he had that same gift. Used to sit for hours watching ants carry crumbs back to their hill, talking to them like they were old friends." Jacob stared into the fire, his face soft with memory. "Mary said he was going to be a naturalist when he grew up. Study animals and plants, write books about what he learned." "How old was he?" Sarah asked gently. 7. Benjamin was 9, and little Mary had just turned 5. Jacob's voice grew quiet. "They all went within a week of each other. The cholera hit our settlement like a plague. Took near half the folks before it burned itself out." Sarah watched his face in the firelight and saw the same hollow look she'd been carrying since Thomas died. "What did you do after?" "Buried them on a hill overlooking the creek where the boys used to catch minnows. Sold everything I couldn't carry. Started writing." Jacob picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending sparks up into the darkness. "Thought if I kept moving, the grief wouldn't catch up to me." "Did it work?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "For a while. But grief is like the desert wind. It follows you no matter which direction you run. Eventually you have to stop and let it blow through you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the high country. A coyote called from somewhere in the hills, and another answered from the opposite ridge. Their song was lonely and wild, but somehow not sad. Just honest in the way that wild things are honest about what they need and what they've lost. "The wind doesn't just take things away," Sarah said finally. "It brings things too. Seeds and rain and new smells from places you've never been." Jacob nodded. "Mary used to say that. Said grief was like a hard winter. It takes what it takes, but it also clears the ground for whatever wants to grow next." Over the following days, Sarah began to notice small changes in herself. She woke each morning without the crushing weight she'd carried since Thomas died. She found herself humming while she fed the chickens, the same songs her brother used to sing. When Jacob suggested they ride out to check the cattle in the south pasture, she saddled their old gelding without the familiar stab of fear about being alone on the range. They worked together easily, as if they'd been partners for years instead of weeks. Jacob taught her to read the signs that told whether the grass was good for grazing, how to spot a sick animal before it spread disease to the herd, which plants to avoid because they carried poison in their leaves. Sarah showed him the secret places Thomas had discovered. The hidden spring where the water ran sweet and cold even in summer, the box canyon where wild horses sometimes came to drink, the eagle's nest high in the red rocks where the same pair had been raising young for as long as anyone could remember. One afternoon, while they were replacing a section of fence near the creek, Jacob straightened up and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're different," he said. "Different how?" "Stronger. Like you decided to stop fighting the wind and start learning to bend with it instead." Sarah considered this, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Maybe I'm just getting tired of being sad all the time." Thomas wouldn't have wanted that. "No," Jacob agreed. "For what you've told me about him, your brother would have wanted you to live. Really live, not just survive." That evening, as they sat by Thomas's grave watching the wildflowers Jacob had planted begin to poke their first green shoots through the soil, Sarah realized something had shifted between them. The careful distance Jacob had maintained was still there, but it felt different now. Less like a wall and more like a door that might open if she found the right words to ask. "How long are you planning to stay?" she asked, not looking at him. Jacob was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were testing the weight of each word. "How long would you like me to stay?" Sarah touched the wooden horse in her pocket, Thomas's gift, and thought about all the things her brother had taught her about courage and choosing to love even when love brought the risk of loss. The question hung between them like morning mist, full of possibility and promise, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The first rain of spring came soft and steady, the kind that soaks deep into the earth without making much noise about it. Sarah woke to the gentle drumming on the cabin roof and the sweet smell of wet sage drifting through her window. When she stepped outside to check on the animals, she saw them, tiny green shoots pushing up around Thomas's grave like small miracles breaking through the hard-packed soil. The wildflower seeds Jacob had planted were keeping their promise. She knelt in the damp earth, touching the tender shoots with careful fingers. Purple lupin and Indian paintbrush, just as he'd said. But there were others too, flowers she didn't recognize, seeds that must have blown in on the wind or been carried by birds from distant places. The ground that had once felt too shallow, too temporary, was becoming something alive and beautiful. When she looked up, Jacob was standing by the barn with his horse saddled and his bedroll tied behind the cantle. His few possessions were already packed in his saddlebags, and he had that careful, distant look she remembered from the first night he'd found her digging. Sarah's heart clenched like a fist in her chest, but she didn't let the feeling show on her face. She'd known this moment would come. Men like Jacob Rivers weren't made for staying in one place too long, and she'd learned enough about him to understand that his leaving wasn't about her or the life they'd built together over the winter months. Some people were born to wander, to carry their healing from place to place like seeds on the wind. She walked toward him slowly, her bare feet leaving prints in the mud. The morning was cool and fresh, washed clean by the rain, and everything seemed to shine with new possibility. "You're leaving," she said. "Not a question. I am." Jacob's voice was gentle but firm. "Time I moved on. You don't need me here anymore, Sarah. You're strong enough to face whatever comes next." Sarah looked at his horse, a solid bay gelding with kind eyes and the patient stance of an animal that had traveled many long roads. She thought about all the mornings she'd watched Jacob curry the horse's coat until it gleamed, the way he always checked its feet and legs before riding out, the quiet conversations she'd heard him having with the animal when he thought no one was listening. "Where will you go?" she asked. "North, I think. Maybe up into Montana territory. Heard there's good work for a man with carpentry skills in the mining camps." Jacob adjusted his hat, settling it at the angle that made him look like he belonged in this wild country. "And you? What will you do?" Sarah touched the small wooden horse in her apron pocket, Thomas's gift that she'd carried every day since he died. The carving was warm from being held close to her body, smooth from countless touches, and it felt suddenly heavy with meaning. "I'll stay," she said simply. "This is my home. Thomas is buried here, and so are my parents. This ground holds everyone I've ever loved." Jacob nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "You'll do well here. You've got the heart for homesteading, patient and stubborn in all the right ways. And you understand now that the land gives back what you put into it, good or bad." They stood looking at each other in the morning light, and Sarah realized she was memorizing his face. The lines around his eyes that spoke of years in the sun and wind. The gray starting to show in his dark hair. The way his mouth curved slightly when he was thinking about something that pleased him. She pulled the wooden horse from her pocket and held it out to him. "I want you to have this," she said. Jacob stared at the carving without taking it. "Sarah, that's your brother's work. You should keep it. Thomas made it to be carried, not to sit on a shelf." Sarah pressed the horse into his palm and closed his fingers around it. He carved it so someone would remember what matters. Love, beauty, the things that make us more than just animals fighting to survive. Jacob looked down at the horse in his weathered hand. "This means everything to you. That's why I'm giving it to you." Sarah stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself against the morning chill. Not as a goodbye, but as a piece of home to carry with you wherever the road takes you. So you'll remember that some places, some people, will always be glad to see you come back. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, turning the carving over in his palm. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "I've got something for you too," he said, walking to his horse and pulling a rifle from the leather scabbard tied to his saddle. It was an older weapon, well cared for, but showing the wear that comes from years of faithful use. "This was my father's. He carried it all through Kansas, defending our homestead from claimed jumpers and raiders." Sarah took the rifle, surprised by its weight and the way it felt balanced in her hands. The stock was smooth walnut, dark with age and oil, and someone had carved small notches near the trigger guard. Not for counting kills, but for marking the years it had been loved and used. "Jacob, I can't take this." "Yes, you can. And you will." His voice was firm but kind. "Not because you need protection, though this country can be hard on folks living alone, but because it's a promise that you're strong enough to face whatever comes. Your brother knew that when he sent you to hide in the cellar. He knew you'd survive and keep going, even when the world tried to break you." Sarah ran her fingers along the smooth stock, feeling the weight of history and intention in her hands. "How do you know I won't just put it in a corner and let it gather dust?" "Because you're not that kind of woman. You're the kind who plants flowers on graves and fixes broken fences and stays when staying is the hardest thing to do." Jacob swung up into his saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd spent half his life on horseback. "Besides, every homestead needs a good rifle. This land's getting more settled every year, but it's not tame yet. May never be." The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the thin mist that had clung to the hills after the rain. Sarah could hear birds singing in the cottonwoods by the creek, and somewhere in the distance, a meadow lark called its liquid song across the wet grass. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Jacob looked toward the mountains, purple in the morning light, then back at her. "Hard to say. I'm not much for making promises about the future. But I know this. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to believe that home isn't just a place you leave behind. Sometimes it's a place you carry with you, and sometimes you're lucky enough to find it more than once." He touched his hat brim in a gesture that was both farewell and blessing. "Take care of those flowers, Sarah McKenna. And take care of yourself." Sarah watched him ride away across the pasture toward the gap in the hills that led to the main trail. He sat his horse like a man who belonged in the saddle, moving with the easy rhythm of someone who'd found his peace with the long road ahead. She stood there until he was just a speck against the distant hillside, then disappeared entirely into the wild country beyond. When she could no longer see him, Sarah walked back to Thomas's grave and knelt among the tender green shoots that were reaching toward the morning sun. She had seeds of her own now, marigolds and zinnias from her mother's garden, saved from before the fever took her parents. Seeds she'd been saving for when she felt ready to plant hope again. She worked with her hands in the soft earth, placing each seed with the same careful attention Jacob had shown when he'd first planted the wildflowers. The ground felt different now. Not too shallow, not temporary. Sacred in the way that places become sacred when they hold more than just bones and sorrow. As she worked, Sarah thought about the lessons she'd learned during the long winter months when Jacob had been part of her daily life. How grief could be shared without being diminished. How healing sometimes looked like building fences and fixing broken things. How love didn't end when someone died. It just changed form, becoming something that lived in stories and memories and the way you chose to honor what they'd given you. She planted the last seed and sat back on her heels, looking at the neat rows she'd made in the earth around her brother's resting place. Come summer, this ground would be alive with color. Purple and red and yellow and orange, a celebration that could be seen from the cabin windows and from the ridge where the eagle's nest sat high in the rocks. The rifle Jacob had given her lay beside her in the grass, solid and reassuring in the morning light. Sarah picked it up and held it properly, the way her father had taught her when she was barely tall enough to hold a gun. The weight felt right in her hands, not like a burden, but like a tool she was finally ready to use. Standing, she looked out across the land that was hers now. The pastures where cattle grazed, the creek that ran year-round, the hills that rolled away toward mountains she'd never climbed but someday might. This place had taken so much from her. Her parents, her brother, her childhood certainty that the people you loved would always be there to love you back. But it had also given her something precious. The knowledge that she could lose everything and still choose to stay, to plant flowers in hard ground, to believe in the possibility that spring would come again and bring new life with it. The ground that had once felt too shallow now held more than just Thomas. It held the love that never dies, the connections that bloom even in the hardest soil, and the promise that some seeds are worth planting even when you can't be sure they'll grow.